My fellow Americans, for more years, I am not a crook.
That doesn't mean there wasn't a stolen election. It's just it was in 1960. You know, it's okay to make fun of Richard Nixon, and it's okay to lampoon him. And yet, as I do this, all I can think of is that unfortunate photo shoot Kathy Griffin did of former President Trump. But I got the idea for this from the 1991 movie Point Break, where they had the ex-presidents gangs and they would all wear these masks. Of course, no one wore a mask of JFK, FDR, or Abe Lincoln. It was Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and Richard Nixon. Americans of a certain age have a visceral reaction to the name Richard Nixon. It's a name that has immediate connotations synonymous with corruption, lies, dirty tricks, black bag operations, anti-Semitism, paranoia. But as Joseph Keller wrote in Catch-22, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't after you. And in Nixon's case, they were. The media was always after him. And now in 2022, we need a reevaluation of Richard Nixon and his career. We need a paradigm shift to replace the subjective construct of Nixon as evil villain with one of Nixon as tragic victim of decades of media persecution. Some work of that has already begun with the excellent biography by Conrad Black. Why would Nixon have felt paranoid or feel the need to have an enemies list? And I don't know about you, but I've often thought of creating my own enemies list. I always get hung up on how to rank them in order. And perhaps the one good lesson from Watergate is that keeping records of that sort of thing doesn't usually work out too good. But my point, why was Nixon paranoid? And let's dispense with the often touted nonsense of a fatal character flaw. First, we need to turn to the media and his relationship with it. And again, he endured horrible media coverage. Let's not forget that his vice presidency bid, his spot on the ticket, was actually placed at risk due to charges in the media of his corruption. And he actually had to go and do a video of himself, the famous Checkers speech, where he made his case for his innocence. He had to fight for his political life. And then following, in the 1960 presidential election, he had to deal with the media infatuation, something that was far greater than what would come decades later with the media's fascination with President Obama, in that of JFK, who had a rock star status internationally in the media. And those debates on, of course, television, where Nixon, after having been sick and having lost weight and not having particularly good color, was up against the younger, more photogenic, makeup wearing John F. Kennedy, hopped up on steroids and other substances, even though he had a fairly serious disease that was being kept from the American public. JFK, a Catholic, who really did not have much chance of defeating the sitting vice president. Furthermore, Nixon, in his epic loss, with apologies to Upton Sinclair, in the California gubernatorial campaign in 1962, blamed the media, infamously staying in what many thought was career suicide, that they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore, in what was characterized as one of the nastiest campaign battles ever, in that between Pat Brown and Nixon, and served to really reinforce his understanding of what the expectations and the rules of engagement were for elections. And he also saw the continued actions of the media, releasing the Pentagon Papers, as something that was not in the best interests of the country, but something that was actually quite damaging. He had good reason to distrust the media. This would only be furthered in the trumping up of the case against him in Watergate. There was also this generational conflict, right? There was the baby boomer generation that was coming of age. And I always think of this as a great analogy. The baby boomer generation and the failure of public housing, because they both involve a disproportionate number of juveniles to adults, and this ending up creating this lost sense of authority, this lost shared parental control over youth, and that emboldened them. And that's essentially what happened to society at large. Now, unlike public housing, which I think the best example of that story coming to its conclusion is Pruitt-Igoe in East St. Louis, although you could make a case that it was Chicago and Cabrini Green, with both those structures eventually being razed, Pruitt-Igoe early on, the Chicago Cabrini Green decades later. Unlike public housing, the baby boomers generally enjoyed unprecedented prosperity at a time when the United States in the post-war years had a disproportionate amount of the world's productive capacity, its infrastructure, its gold, and its other financial resources, a condition that could never realistically remain permanent. Naive, idealistic youth on the one hand, disdain for order, authority, and social convention on the other. The baby boomers were a generation that had wanted for nothing, unlike their parents who had experienced great scarcity in the Depression, and wanted their children never to experience that. So Vietnam, Watergate, the protests, these could all be considered the spoiled temper tantrums of children who were enabled by a lack of discipline, by the liberal post-war consensus, and perhaps nihilistic and even anti-American interests at work. Even so, statistically, only 13% of students identified with the New Left. The typical middle voter was, as Richard M. Scammon and Ben J. Wattenberg observed, a 47-year-old housewife from the outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, whose husband was a machinist. And I'm somewhat quoting them there. The antics of activists were not widely approved of, and aside from the progressive leaders who saw them as another resource, another tool to leverage in the advance of their cause or causes, young radicals, if anything, alienated voters and pushed them towards Nixon. There really was a silent majority whose concerns Nixon spoke to. This gave even more reason to those seeking a more progressive agenda, who knew what was best for that machinist's wife and the machinist, as well as the nation as a whole, for their hatred of Nixon. There was a critical breakdown in the order of society, and the unrestrained behavior of youth and their excessive naivete and idealism and their thirst for parricide made Nixon a tempting target. There's a theory that as middle-class professionals advance in a society, taking cherished positions in education, in government, and social work, they can actually become like a lactic acid in the muscles of a society, a fifth column, threatening the society from within like a cancerous tumor. And there's a case to be made that that's what happened in the 60s and 70s. Ronald Inglehart wrote The Silent Revolution, where he wrote about the shift in societal priorities from the material and security almost upwards, advancing along something similar to a society-wide Maslow hierarchy. And that's really what was happening. And Nixon could see the anarchy at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. In fact, if you have the chance, you should check out the Living Room Candidate, where they have election videos of the televised campaigns and in their campaign commercials. And his campaign made really good use of footage from the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where protesters are storming and rioting, and police are putting them down with their truncheons and arresting them. And it really showed the nation descending into chaos. And M.J. Heel noted that there's a case to be made that Nixon was the savior of American democracy. Nixon also provided liberals with a convenient scapegoat after Johnson for the epic failure of all their domestic and foreign policy agenda since the 1960s. Youth could transfer their anger at their parents, first to Johnson and then to Nixon. Nixon was held to a higher standard than his predecessors. There was nothing that Nixon had done that Johnson hadn't done before him. Any suggestion to the contrary is uninformed and disingenuous. In fact, Nixon, his very telephones, LBJ, had ordered that Nixon's campaign phones be wiretapped long before the plumbers ever entered into the Watergate Hotel. Nixon had LBJ, had won his first campaign because he liberally utilized lies, bribes, and intimidation, I'm quoting, in the most corrupt election in Texas history, and the one that forever won him the moniker Landslide Lindy, when despite all those horrible efforts, he won by only 87 votes. LBJ knew elections were for sale in Texas, and he was willing to pay. He was also largely the architect for the 1960 presidential election, whose outcome to this day is highly suspect at best. There are serious questions about the impropriety in the 1960 presidential elections, serious questions about the role of machines in St. Louis and Chicago and how they stuffed the ballot box. And in fact, his advisors came to Nixon and said, "We've got a case here." And Nixon said, "No, we're going to take the higher road, and we're not going to contest it because it would be bad for the nation." Philip F. Nelson and Roger Stone have written books that cast LBJ as their prime suspect for the assassination of John F. Kennedy and as his way to have a coup. Not only LBJ, but most presidents engaged in some mudslinging and gamesmanship. In Watergate, Nixon was merely adapting to those rules of engagement, those rules as he understood them and had experienced them and were well established by the time he was running for re-election. And unfortunately for him, much like Monica Lewinsky's scandal in the Clinton administration, those rules abruptly changed without notice. Critics point out that Nixon supposedly lied, yet we lionize Eisenhower despite his U2 Francis Gary Powers cover-up. In fact, the record on presidential truthfulness is quite sobering when examined. Like in the French Revolution, there was a thirst for blood, a need to sacrifice someone. The actual actions that Nixon took arguably saved a nation from descent into anarchy. Communism was a real threat. He had gone toe-to-toe with Nikita Khrushchev in the kitchen debate in Moscow. He was on HUAC when it investigated Albert Hiss. He knew how the Soviets had infiltrated the media and student movements in Europe and the United States, as well as Hollywood. He perceived the threat of anti-materialism, socialism, and anti-establishmentism. He was trying to save America from the same infection Pinochet was trying to save Chile from, and whom Nixon was supporting. Pinochet, whose name has a similar connotation in America, but it actually has a mixed one in his own country, where many view him as the savior of Chile from communism. And to save that nation, a cancerous tumor on the body politic was going to have to be removed and sacrifices made in a number of treatments and chemotherapy. As this was true in Chile, as it was going to be true in the United States as well. Pinochet, too, is held to a far harder standard than that of many leftist leaders. As former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick observed, the U.S. held authoritarian friends like Pinochet and the Shah of Iran to far higher standards than its totalitarian enemies like the Soviets or Castro in Cuba. Nixon had a vision of how to save the nation. He was going to restructure the electoral landscape by pulling in blue-collar voters, working-class voters from Eastern elites who had snubbed and looked down on them. He would co-opt the Southern Democrat states and form a new consensus behind his hand-picked successor, Treasury Secretary and former Texas Governor John Connally, who was actually in the car when Kennedy was assassinated. He would outflank the liberals. He would take over their programs and run them better, more efficiently, and more effectively. As noted by A.J. Heel, it was no accident that school integration, affirmative action, environmental legislation, expanded Social Security benefits all occurred on his watch. He also found methadone as the treatment for opiate abuse and made it available nationally in an effort to cut down on crime. To build this new consensus, he was willing to pump the falling economy, failing because of LBJ and both trying to wage his Vietnam War and fund his Great Society on steroids and methamphetamines, even though it would naturally collapse in due order after the election. When inflation raged and liberals tried to trap him by passing a bill for price controls, in a master stroke, he called their bluff and signed it. It was all designed to give him the landslide mandate he needed to save the country from the left. When looking at Watergate today, we need to wonder, particularly in light of more recent elections, if it all wasn't just a ploy to overturn the 1972 election. We need to be wary of the official historiography of Watergate. The generation coming of age was going to have its pound of flesh. And the difference between an illegitimate coup, treasonous uprising, and a just cause, in the history books anyway, is often found in the outcome. Thank you.